guys. I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is I didn't prepare my presentation. The good news is I won't throw off the curve. Oh, come on, guys. Well, I would have had it ready, but drank heavily and allowed my father to use her. Consequently, I have absolutely no attention span whatsoever. So what? Oh. That's bad news. So you see, every time I tried to sit down and write this speech, something else came up. Like, my mom needed arugula from the grocery store. Or I had to do my laundry. There was an important meeting for Students Against Drunk Drivers. And besides, Blood Bowl 7 was on. So you see, I really had no chance to prepare this speech. But don't blame me. Blame Mariachi and the Marlboro Man. Does this sound familiar? It should, because what you've just seen is a classic example of a phenomenon that has become all too common in American society. It's called victimization, which, according to the June 3rd, 1991 issue of New York Magazine, is trying to find someone or something else to blame for whatever is wrong with one's life. And although you may not be aware of it, you've been both an observer and a participant of it since you were born. As a sociology class that studies the various problems of our culture, we must realize that we have become a society of finger pointers, with no one taking responsibility for their actions. In order to gain a better understanding of victimization, we'll first look at some examples of dodging responsibility, then examine the consequences of these actions, and finally, in the ultimate showing of social responsibility, try to devise some solutions to the growing problem of the blame game. To properly examine victimization, we must first look at the culprits. The November 4th, 1985 issue of People Weekly recalls the story of Dan White. In 1978, White was charged with the murder of San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and his associate, Harvey Milk. Now, White's attorney conceded that he did indeed kill the two men, but argued that he was temporarily insane at the time because he ate too many Twinkies. Hey, it's not every day that you see golden sponge cake and creamy filling used as an alibi for homicide. But in this case, it worked. The charges were reduced from murder to manslaughter, and White was released on parole after only 5 years in prison. What kind of ding-dong society are we? However, one need not commit a felony in order to cry victimization. The USA Today of September 15, 1994, tells us the story of 81-year-old Stella Liebeck. One brisk April morn, Stella went up to the McDonald's drive-thru to order a cup of coffee. As she carefully maneuvered her 1978 sky blue Lincoln Town Car out of the parking lot, the coffee cup overturned onto Stella's lap, causing third-degree burns and minor irritations. Stella's first reaction? Whoa, hot! Her second reaction was to sue McDonald's for $2.7 million. Now, just to get the facts straight, she didn't argue that a poorly maintained parking lot caused her accident, nor did she cry that the hamburger sprang from the back seat, jiggled her arm, and caused her coffee cup to topple. She merely claimed that McDonald's was responsible for her injuries because the coffee they served was too hot. Trial testimony did indicate that McDonald's coffee is served at approximately 180 degrees, whereas most homebrewed coffee is a mere 140. Based upon this reasoning, Liebeck was awarded $480,000 in punitive damages for what the judge called willful, wanton, reckless, and callous behavior by McDonald's. Now, I myself was curious about the difference between 140 and 180 degrees, so I decided to conduct my own little experiment. I made 2 cups of coffee at 140 and 180 degrees, respectively. I then thrust my little brother's hand into each. As he lay writhing in pain on the floor, I tried to ask him which hand hurt the most, which, to my dismay, he was unable to distinguish the difference between the two as he lay crying, kicking, and cursing the day I was born. Well, so far, we've seen examples of dodging responsibility and seen where it's even been beneficial to the defendant. So right now, you're probably asking yourself 2 things. 1, Twinkies? And 2, well, if it worked for them, what's so wrong with that? Well, this growing trend of the 90s holds several severe consequences. One result that hits home for us, young people just entering the workforce, pertains to economics. According to the June 3rd, 1991 issue of New York Magazine, this victimization trend is largely responsible for the $117 billion spent annually on insurance to protect against litigation. $117 billion comes out to over $450 for every man, woman, and child in America. You know, with $450, you could buy 548 cups of McDonald's coffee, now served at 140 degrees. Thanks, Stella. But perhaps the most severe consequence of America's lack of responsibility cannot be seen on CNN's coverage of the New York Stock Exchange. The biggest danger of victimization is its contribution to the breakdown of moral values in America. According to that same issue of New York, this reliance upon victimization as an excuse for anything has caused our society to collapse upon itself. When the average American sees a killer acquitted because of society's influence on him, that individual will logically use that defense to justify any faults in his or her own life. All of a sudden, nothing we do is our fault, and personal responsibility has gone out the window. Well, now that we've seen examples of dodging responsibility and identified some consequences of those actions, the logical question to ask ourselves is, what can we do about it? Well, the first solution is obvious. Stop it. A second solution, according to the 1990 book Guideposts, is to start instilling the proper values of responsibility in our children. Author Ruben Greenberg tells parents to let your kids know that just as there are actions for which they can win praise, so there are others that are unacceptable and for which they will be punished. Ruben goes on to say that this doesn't mean if Danny and Keith were to miss the family bus, then Mrs. Partridge should smash the bejeebers out of them with a roll. But she should set clear examples of what is right and what is wrong, and respond to their actions appropriately. And end with a song. But while this is indeed a practical solution, it does little for us. After all, we're just sociology students, so most of us won't be parents for a long time. Therefore, we have to come up with our own solution. We have to change ourselves. When our algebra test doesn't get studied for because we decide to stay up and catch Baywatch instead, it's not David Hasselhoff's fault. When our parents are forced to ground us for breaking a clearly set curfew, it's still not David Hasselhoff's fault. There's no one to blame but ourselves. We need to stop insisting that the world should be handed to us on a silver platter with no work whatsoever on our part. It's time for every American to stand up and act as mature as we wish to be treated. Today, we've defined victimization and seen some of its ramifications on our society. We've seen examples of dodging responsibility and learned that these actions have severe financial and moral consequences. And hopefully, we've realized that to put an end to this "it's not my fault" attitude we see so often in America today, we, the John Does and the Jane Roes of our society, must start changing ourselves and accepting responsibility for what we have done. And after all this, if you're still unwilling to own up to your responsibilities, don't blame me.